Imagine, if you will, a young colonial nation, advancing thousands of miles across a massive continental landmass, utilizing their superior firepower to subdue and marginalize disease-ravaged native communities on their march to the Pacific Ocean. This is a story most commonly associated with the United States and its genocide of the Native Americans. Yet, across the freezing waters of the Bering Sea, a somewhat similar tale was taking place. A tale which has made Russia the largest country on Earth. Today, we will highlight an often overlooked chapter in the history of colonialism, recounting a sordid saga of conquest and genocide across the endless taiga and frigid tundra. Welcome to our video on the Russian conquest of Siberia.
Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job.
Sprawling across a mind-boggling 13 million square kilometers of taiga, marshes, mountains, and frigid tundra, the region of Siberia is the northernmost section of the Asian continent, comprising 77% of Russia's total landmass and stretching over 17% of the Earth's total surface. Siberia's unforgiving northern climes are some of the coldest places on Earth, and is, consequently, among the most sparsely populated places on the planet. Despite this, Siberia has been home to a remarkable display of human diversity since time immemorial, hosting dozens of native nations who spoke dozens of unique and wildly divergent languages. Culture and customs among the diverse Siberian peoples varied significantly from nation to nation, but most of them lived a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle, centered around the herding of domesticated reindeer, which provided crucial meat, milk, and fur, as well as transportation across the rugged, snowy terrain. Religiously speaking, the native Siberians mainly practiced different forms of animism, relying on shamans to communicate on their behalf with the spirits that dwelled in the rivers, trees, and sky. Despite its remoteness, Siberia was never isolated from the outside world. Over the millennia, several groups of conquering horse archers from the Great Eurasian Steppe rode forth and mastered the region, including the Scythians, the Turkic Khaganate, and the Mongols of Genghis Khan. The main resource that drew outside empires into Siberia, despite its incredibly hostile climate, was its furs. Far northern mammalian species native to Siberia, such as lynx, sables, and Arctic foxes, possessed thick, soft, and luscious pelts, which were as luxurious as they were practical in cold weather. By the time of the Mongol Empire, Siberian furs had become a symbol of nobility across Asia. Ultimately, it was the extremely lucrative fur trade which eventually brought Siberia into the crosshairs of its current European occupier. For centuries before there even was a Russia, the ancestors of the Russian people were aware of the vast Siberian landmass directly to their east. Long before the rise of a Tsardom in Moscow, the medieval Slavic principality of Novgorod had begun probing beyond the Urals in search of lucrative animal pelts. Driven by a lust for furs, Novgorodian explorers began venturing into western Siberia along the river Ob as early as the 11th century CE. They named these eastern frontier lands the Land of the Yugor, with Yugor being a blanket term applied over several West Siberian indigenous tribes, such as the Khanty, Mansi, Komi, and the Samoyeds. Early Novgorodian expeditions into Siberia often took the form of violent attempts at forcing the natives into providing tribute in furs, setting the tone for the Russian Empire's expansion into the region in later centuries. Armed with sturdy spears and longbows and armored in chainmail, the Uralic warriors of Siberia annihilated several Novgorodian expeditions and, although paying tribute at times, managed to avoid total subjugation. The true conquest of Siberia would only begin in the 16th century, after the formation of the Tsardom of Russia. In 1480, the Grand Duchy of Moscow threw off the last vestiges of Mongol overlordship, before embarking on a series of military campaigns that brought Novgorod and all the other princedoms of northern Rus under their rule. In 1547, the infamous Ivan IV, the Terrible, elevated his standing among the rulers of Europe by giving himself the imperial title of Tsar. Fueled by a hunger for regional supremacy, the Imperial Russian state inaugurated the first 10 years of its existence by conquering the Turco-Mongol Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, thereby annexing the entire Volga region and opening the way to the Ural Mountains and the wealth of precious furs that lay beyond them. As the Russians set their sights eastwards, they met eyes with a powerful new rival. Known for being the northernmost Islamic state in recorded history, the Khanate of Sibir was founded in 1468 by Kipchak Turks, fleeing the destructive clan warfare of the declining Golden Horde. Despite their remoteness from the rest of the Muslim world, the Khanate of Sibir was no cultural backwater. Grand mosques were built within its fortress settlements, while extensive cultural and commercial ties were established with grand Islamic centers in Central Asia, such as Bukhara and Samarkand. After witnessing the Russian conquests of Kazan and Astrakhan, the Siberian Khan Yediga made the pragmatic move of acknowledging himself as a vassal of Russia, and promising to pay a yearly tribute of 1,000 sable skins. However, Yediga Khan was deposed by a dynastic rival named Kuchum in 1573. Reversing his predecessor's policy, Kuchum reneged the Siberian Khanate's vassalage to Moscow. This turn of events necessitated a powerful response from Moscow. But Russia was presently occupied with waging the grueling Livonian War, and did not have the military resources to spare for a punitive expedition into Siberia. To that end, Ivan the Terrible turned to the Stroganovs, a family of merchant lords with extensive lands on Russia's eastern frontier, providing them with a license to raise a private army and claim lands east of the Urals. Eager for this opportunity to expand their family domains, the Stroganovs hired a Cossack bandit named Yermak to invade the Siberian Khanate on their behalf. As a vagabond with a price on his head, the outlaw accepted the job offer in exchange for a pardon. In 1581, Yermak began his voyage into the depths of Siberia, along the Tagil and Tura rivers with a band of 1,636 men. Armed with muskets, against an enemy with no gunpowder weaponry of their own, Yermak's Cossacks blasted their way into the Khan's capital before routing a Siberian force several times their size at the 3-day bloody Battle of Chuvash Cape. It took another decade to fully pacify regional pockets of resistance, but the Yermak expedition ultimately resulted in the total annexation of the Khanate of Sibir into the Tsardom of Russia. Following the dismantlement of the Khanate of Sibir, the Russians continued on an interminable eastward march. Driven by the pursuit for ever more sources of valuable furs, they struggled through thousands of kilometers of impenetrable taiga forests, marshes, mountains, and tundra into the fully unknown lands of central and eastern Siberia. The Russian exploration of Siberia was carried out not by a professional state army, but by hired Cossack mercenaries. The Cossacks were autonomous military societies from the ungovernable borderlands between the Polish and Russian empires, along the Don and Dnieper rivers. They regularly rejected the authority of Moscow, electing their own leaders and following their own laws. The Cossacks' refusal to submit to the full control of the Tsar was a constant frustration to Russia. But their skill in soldiering and adaptability in rugged terrain made them extremely versatile mercenaries. Unburdened by any semblance of military discipline, the Cossacks in Siberia conducted themselves as packs of vicious blackguards, living out their cruelest fantasies upon their victims. Given no pay by the state, they were encouraged to earn their profits with plunder extracted from indigenous Siberians, further incentivizing their brutal extortion, massacre, and enslavement of native peoples. Throughout the early 17th century, the Cossacks continued their ferocious eastward push, conquering new territories around the size of the modern-day Netherlands with each passing year. Native nations such as the Selkups, Tungus, and Yakuts were soon placed under the Tsarist boot, unable to mount an effective resistance against the Russian onslaught. The most superficial reason for this was that the Cossacks had guns and the natives did not, but this was only part of the story. At the beginning of the 17th century, the population of the Tsardom of Russia was around 10 million. In contrast, the population of Siberia was probably no more than 300,000, divided among dozens of different languages and cultures and dispersed across a landmass 54 times larger than Britain. Moreover, the conquest of Siberia also resulted in the spread of diseases, which native peoples had no prior immunity to. Smallpox alone reaped a macabre harvest, tragically wiping out over 80% of the Tungus and Yakut populations. When all these factors are stacked together, it is hard not to notice the striking parallels between Russia's conquest of their Wild East and the United States' conquest of their Wild West. As two sides of the same imperialist coin, both nations spread the same germs to their respective native populations before exploiting the same advantages to push their way across their respective continental landmasses to the Pacific Ocean. As the Cossacks carved a bloody swath through the taiga, a deluge of colonists followed in their wake. By the beginning of the 18th century, Russian settlers had already made up over 50% of Siberia's total population, a percentage which would only increase as mass migration intensified in later centuries. Settler-colonialism in Siberia was clustered around a network of ostrogs, wooden fortresses built on the banks of Siberia's mighty rivers to exert power over the surrounding native peoples. The majority of Russian settlers in Siberia were peasants. Many others were criminals, political dissidents, and prisoners of war who had been sent into exile, thereby inaugurating a long-standing Russian tradition of Siberian deportations, which would continue until the time of Stalin. The Russian Orthodox Church followed the Russian state into Siberia, where its clergy were horrified to witness the rapacious character of the Cossacks and the heathen ways of the natives. Orthodox priests attempted to civilize the rowdy Cossacks and convert the pagans, largely to no avail. The Cossacks continued to drink, brawl, and plunder, while the natives embraced Christianity only superficially, continuing to practice their animist traditions when the priests turned their eyes elsewhere. Although the Russians successfully introduced agriculture to Siberia, the colonized region was still dominated by the incredibly lucrative fur trade. Today, a brand-name coat of sable fur can cost upwards of $20,000. The price tag was even higher back in the 17th century, when a single sable pelt in good condition sold for over 10 times what a peasant family earned in a year. By the end of the 17th century, the Siberian fur trade had gone global, tapping into markets in Western Europe, Persia, China, and beyond. The wealth of this trade fueled Russia's wars in Europe, such as when Tsar Peter the Great declared a state monopoly on sable furs to fund the astronomically expensive Great Northern War against Sweden and Poland-Lithuania. The Russians acquired their furs primarily from indigenous Siberian nations, who were forced to provide a regular tribute of valuable animal skins to their nearest ostrog. This extortion racket, known as yasak, put immense strain on traditional indigenous lifestyles, to say nothing of the violence that would be inflicted upon them if they failed to deliver. Like the Cossacks, Russian frontier governors were not paid by the government and were expected to nourish themselves off what could be extracted from the natives, further increasing fur quotas and exacerbating indigenous exploitation at colonial hands. The mistreatment of the Aboriginals occurred not just at the hands of government officials, but independent trappers as well. At the height of the Siberian fur trade, thousands of peasants looking to strike it big on sable pelts left their farms and became independent fur hunters, known as promyshleniki. When these trappers failed to bag their own pelts, they terrorized the natives into providing for them. Promyshleniki fortune seekers regularly kidnapped indigenous women and children, holding them hostage and selling them back to their men for a sable pelt apiece. As Russia pushed deeper and deeper into Asia, it soon found itself bumping up against the most powerful empire in the world, the Qing dynasty of China. After conquering the Ming dynasty in 1644, the Manchu emperors of the Qing began expanding northwards into the outer reaches of Mongolia and the Amur River region, putting them on a collision course with Russia. The Qing made for a formidable enemy. Far removed from the small, disease-ravaged communities the Cossacks had been slicing through, the Manchus possessed a huge and professional gunpowder army. In 1685, a Qing force of 6,000 men and 100 cannon destroyed the crucial Russian ostrog of Albazin on the Amur River. The Russians rebuilt the fortress the next year, and this time managed to hold out against an invading force 10 times their size. Thereafter, representatives of both powers finally convened to draw a satisfactory border between their respective empires. The result was the 1689 Treaty of Nerchinsk, in which Russia was forced to abandon the Albazin ostrog and cede the left bank of the Amur River, while the Qing relinquished its claims towards the lands around Lake Baikal. With the China issue squared away, the Russians began exploring the Pacific coast around the Kamchatka Peninsula. The indigenous nations of this wild and extraordinarily remote country were the Koryaks, Itelmens, and Chukchis, ancient peoples who had lived in eastern Siberia since the Ice Age and who bore prehistoric cultural links to the ancestors of the Native Americans that had crossed the ice bridge into North America over 10,000 years ago. According to Russian accounts, the Koryaks, Itelmens, and Chukchis stood out among other Siberian peoples for their warlike ferocity. They fought in thick lamellar armor made of whale skin, reinforced with bone and antler plates, constantly raiding one another with the aim of carrying off slaves and reindeer herds. Despite their bellicosity, the natives of the Siberian Far East were subjugated by the Cossacks after 1697, who exploited the natural divisions among them to subdue their fractious clans one by one. Thereafter, the Cossacks imposed the yasak on the natives and enslaved the women and children of any clans who failed to meet the fur quota. This inhumane treatment served only to unite formerly warring clans together against the Russian menace. By 1706, most of the Chukchis, Koryaks, and Itelmens had erupted into open rebellion. The natives took Cossack ostrogs by surprise, burning down the forts and seizing the muskets within, which they learned how to operate remarkably quickly. By 1729, the Russian war effort had been taken over by the remarkably barbaric Major Dmitry Pavlutsky, who utilized terror tactics to bring the Aboriginals to their knees, presiding over the mass slaughters and enslavement of Chukchi women and children. By 1741, the Itelmens had been largely subdued, but many Koryaks and Chukchis still defied the authority of Russia. Over 6,000 kilometers away, in distant St. Petersburg, the Senate of Empress Catherine ordered the total extirpation of the Koryak and Chukchi people, demanding their complete ethnic cleansing from their native lands. Yet, the Koryaks and Chukchis refused to disappear. They savaged themselves upon the Russians, even capturing and beheading the reviled Major Pavlutsky in 1747. Eventually worn down by ceaseless Russian aggression and a smallpox epidemic that had reduced their population by half, the Koryaks finally submitted to the Russian crown in 1757. Despite this, the Russians had been forced to abandon their plans to commit genocide on the Koryaks which had been made impractical due to their feral resistance. The Chukchis, however, were never fully subdued. Despite Russian claims in the 18th century that all of Siberia had been conquered, the Chukchis never paid the yasak tribute. Their territory in the Arctic Circle was simply too remote to hold, so long as its native population remained warlike and determined. The Chukchis did not accept de facto Russian overlordship until after the Revolution of 1917, making them the only Siberian people to never be conquered by the Empire of the Tsars. By the 18th century, Russia had subdued the vast majority of North Asia, and in doing so, had become the largest contiguous land empire on Earth. Further acquisitions continued for another 200 years. The regions of Amur, Tuva, and Outer Manchuria were seized from a now weakened Qing dynasty China after 1858, as was the island of Sakhalin, which was split between Russia and the rapidly rising Empire of Japan. There, yet more native people, such as the Nivkas and Oroks, suffered heavily under a Cossack onslaught. Pressed by the Japanese from the south and Russians to the north, the Ainu people of Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands faced colonization from two sides. Today, the indigenous peoples of Siberia only make up around 5% of the region's population, with the rest being overwhelmingly ethnic Russian. Major cities such as Omsk, Novosibirsk, and Vladivostok cement Russia's permanent presence in the land beyond the Urals, now connected to Moscow and St. Petersburg via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Nevertheless, the natives of Siberia are still here to this day, outlasting the Cossacks who once tried to exterminate them. Despite their marginalization, they endured the centuries, surviving the cultural Russification policies of the 19th century, the turmoil of the Russian Revolution, and the Soviet collectivization policies which further devastated their traditional way of life. Despite all of that, indigenous Siberians fought side by side with every other nation in the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War against the Nazis. As of the making of this video, the indigenous peoples of Siberia still face an uncertain future under Vladimir Putin's authoritarian regime, in which indigenous activists are silenced and indigenous men are disproportionately conscripted into the army and used as cannon fodder in the illegal invasion of Ukraine. Siberia was far from the only place that Russia ever colonized, but while the occupied nations of Central Asia and Eastern Europe gained their independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the indigenous nations of Siberia never did. Indeed, the legacy of the Russian colonization of Siberia is one that continues actively to this very day. More videos on Russian history are on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.